Welcome back, everyone. I am so excited to jump into today's explainer because we are tackling one of the absolute most iconic and dramatic moments in all of ancient literature. We're talking about Exodus chapter 14, the parting of the Red Sea. But we aren't just going to skim the surface of this famous story. We're really going to break down the study notes and historical commentaries and look at this massive event through a really specific structured lens. We're going to examine the text itself, the historical context surrounding it, and my personal favorite, the deeply fascinating character profile of the man right at the center of it all.
So, here's our roadmap for unpacking all the drama, history, and psychology found in our source text. We'll start with Trapped at the Sea, move on to mapping the Exodus, dive into the debate over how deep was it, uncover the missing historical record, and finally wrap things up with the profile of Moses. All right, Section 1, Trapped at the Sea, Nowhere to Run.
To really grasp the sheer gravity of this text, you have to understand the physical reality on the ground. The Israelites have just fled Egypt, right? But they are definitely not out of the woods, or, well, out of the desert just yet. If you trace their journey, they leave Goshen, camp at Succoth, and hit Etham on the edge of the desert. But then, following divine instruction, they actually turn back. Literally, they reverse course. They encamp near Pi-hahiroth, right between Migdol and the sea, directly opposite Baal-zephon. Geographically speaking, by turning back and putting themselves between the mountains and the water, they've effectively boxed themselves in. To any outside observer, they just looked totally confused, wandering aimlessly around the land. And that perceived confusion? Well, that is exactly what prompted Pharaoh to strike. To make matters infinitely worse, Pharaoh decides he's made a huge mistake letting his labor force go, so he mobilizes his elite military. He dispatches 600 of his absolute best chariots to bear down on the helpless Israelites. To put that into perspective, this was a terrifying force. We're talking about chariots made of wood or leather, set over two wheels and pulled by incredibly fast horses. Each one carried two men, one driving and one fighting. For the ancient world, this was literally the equivalent of an armored tank division rolling in, and the Israelites were utterly trapped.
So naturally, the people just panic. They turn on Moses, basically yelling that it would have been better to stay slaves in Egypt than to die out in the desert. Moses tries to calm everyone down, but he also cries out to God. And the study notes highlight God's amazingly direct, action-oriented response in verse 15. The divine message basically boils down to this: stop praying and get moving. It's such a fascinating insight, isn't it? Like, prayer is absolutely crucial, but sometimes we kind of use it as an excuse to put off doing the thing we already know we need to do. There is a time for prayer, for sure, but there's also a time for action.
Okay, Section 2, Mapping the Exodus. When exactly did this happen? Pinning down ancient events on a modern calendar is notoriously difficult, so we impartially look at the two primary theories scholars use. The first is the early date theory, which places the Exodus around 1446 to 1445 BC. This is based on a literal reading of 1 Kings 6:1, which says Solomon began building the temple 480 years after the Hebrews left Egypt. Since most agree Solomon's temple construction kicked off in 966 BC, you just do the math and boom, you're in the 1440s. On the flip side, we have the late date theory. This puts the event around 1290 BC. Proponents here argue that those 480 years shouldn't be taken literally. Instead, they point to Exodus 1:11, noting that the Hebrews built the store cities of Pithom and Ramesses, named after Pharaoh Ramesses II, who reigned around 1290 BC. Both are really compelling arguments that draw directly from the biblical texts. Moving right along to Section 3, Debating the Depth. Are we talking about a simple wade or a massive miracle? Just like the timeline, the actual physical nature of the crossing is heavily debated in our sources. When examining the event, some suggest the Israelites didn't actually cross the main body of the Red Sea, but maybe one of the shallow lakes or marshes just north of it. The idea here is that these marshes might dry up at certain times of the year, or maybe a smaller branch of the sea was just shallow enough to wade across. This is often viewed as the more secular, naturalistic explanation for what happened. But that secular theory stands in really stark contrast to the explicit claims of the text itself. The Bible explicitly says the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and divided the waters, forming a literal wall of water on their right and on their left. Plus, think about it. The water had to be deep enough to completely submerge Pharaoh's heavy chariots and horsemen when it crashed back down. So regardless of where you fall on the geographical debate, the source insists the narrative is undeniably describing a miraculous deep water event designed to show off divine power. It's definitely not just a lucky wade through a muddy puddle.
Which brings us to Section 4, the missing historical record. Where is the proof?
Now we have to tackle a really crucial point.
the glaring absence of external historical evidence. I mean, if this was this massive, miraculous event that literally decimated the superpower of the ancient world, where is the proof outside of the Bible? It's a highly valid question. If an entire army of 600 premium chariots, along with all their elite officers and horses, was utterly wiped out in the sea by a fleeing population of slaves, why wouldn't the Egyptians like that down? They were meticulous record keepers.
Well, the notes provide a totally fascinating sociological answer. It turns out ancient Egyptian pharaohs had their own version of a delete button. It was actually standard practice for them to completely ignore their defeats in official records. They would literally go back and chisel out the names of traitors and political adversaries from existing monuments. A pharaoh who was considered a living god would be especially anxious to cover up the fact that his magnificent army was destroyed while chasing a band of runaway slaves. When you look at it that way, the complete lack of an Egyptian record is exactly what historians should expect to find.
And finally, Section 5, the profile of Moses, the leader in the storm. For our final takeaway, we're going to pivot away from the macro history and zoom in on an intimate character study of the man at the center of the storm. The source material has this extensive sidebar that gives us a surprisingly raw, humanizing look at Moses. It strips away all the legendary myth and shows us a figure who was honestly incredibly flawed. It asks us to look at how God takes existing characteristics, both the good and the bad, and molds them over a lifetime. The profile objectively lays out his vital statistics, and wow, did he have monumental strengths. He had an elite Egyptian education, intense desert survival training, and he served as a prophet, a lawgiver, and the author of the Pentateuch. But his weaknesses were severe. For one, he didn't always recognize or utilize the talents of the people around him. And most tragically, his own personal disobedience to God ultimately brought a huge consequence. The greatest Jewish leader failed to enter the Promised Land himself. It's a stark reminder that personal greatness doesn't make anyone immune to errors or consequences.
But honestly, the most compelling insight in this whole profile is the analysis of his temperament. It notes that for Moses, reaction is their favorite action. Throughout his early life, he was super impulsive. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, he reacted. He saw two kinsmen fighting, he reacted. But over the years, something amazing happened to his character. He slowly learned to stop just reacting and started acting correctly under pressure. Think about it. Leading 2 million bickering, complaining people through a harsh desert forced him to become a buffer between the people and God. He had to learn how to absorb immense stress without just lashing out on instinct. And that really brings everything together beautifully. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider this lesson from Moses' frailty and his growth. The text shows us that true leadership requires developing habits of obedience when the stress is low, so that when the crisis actually hits, taking the right action becomes your natural reaction. So, I'll leave you with this. When the chariots are closing in on you and your back is against the sea, how do you respond? Do you let panic dictate a wild reaction, or do you have the discipline to take the right action? Thanks so much for exploring with me today, and I'll catch you next time.